everybody, today I've been visited by the ghost of performance car past in the form of this, the Vauxhall Vectra VXR. Generation Vauxhall Vectra, the C, was launched in 2002 and lasted until 2010. In Europe it was badged as the Opel, but here in Britain it was sold exclusively as a Vauxhall. It being made during the time when Vauxhall was part of the GM empire, it also had a sibling in the form of the Saab 9-3, though that was a more different car than you might expect and GM wanted. Unfortunately for Vauxhall, the third generation Vectra always had the deck stacked against it, where in the decades previous the likes of the Vectra, the Cavalier and the Mondeo really were the kings of the road. By the early 2000s, that was not the case. Customer appetite combined with increasingly aggressive finance deals meant that the Germans had arrived in force, where previously a BMW or Mercedes had been a rare sight come the early 2000s, and they were not. And so, by the end of the decade, this car and its ilk were essentially extinct. They did follow it up with the Insignia, but when was the last time you saw one of those? In any case, I have driven a Vectra C before, an example of the V6 Turbo, essentially the model below this, and I found myself rather liking it. In spite of the divisive looks that from some angles are great and others not so, and the rather cheap interior that just isn't good enough, I actually found it a car with many fine qualities. The combination of automatic gearbox, very good performing but also surprisingly economical turbo engine, and the car's fairly soft setup meant it was an excellent motorway cruiser. However, this was a car aimed at a very different audience. The VXR is the performance one, and compared with the Vectra I drove last, there are a few changes. From the outside, there are a few subtle enhancements, but honestly, I couldn't really point them out to you. I'm sure the wheels, bumpers and the like are slightly different, but as you can probably tell, this car is not in pristine condition. Before you have a go at its owner, George, who's been very kind in bringing it out to me today, I should point one thing out, which is that he saved this car from going to the scrapyard, and over the last years it's been a sort of rolling restoration project which he's still in the middle of. The engine is fundamentally the same as in the last one that I drove. It's a 2.8 litre high feature engine built by Holden in Australia with a twin scroll turbo. Here in the later cars it made 280 horsepower up on 250 from the early ones, but I am told that 280 could be a very conservative figure. This car was thrown on a dyno and it made 320, and as far as they could see, it wasn't a car that had been mapped either. The suspension is also lower and stiffer than the standard item, but the biggest change of all, and of great appeal to petrol heads, will be the fact that whereas the V6 Turbo came only as an automatic, this one came only as a manual. Here, a 6-speed item that, long throw aside, is actually quite nice to use. The engine is very keen from fairly low RPM, has plenty of shove and is quite responsive too. I like it. The noise though really does surprise me, because when George pulled up in the car park this morning, I was convinced this car was modified. I thought, no way is that a standard exhaust, but I am told it really is. He also was doubtful, so had the car on a ramp pretty quickly, and it's a genuine GM item, has both catalytic converters in place. In fact, the only part of the whole thing that we know is not standard is the air intake. The previous owner, or one of them anyway, has taken the original airbox out and put in your classic hot air cone filter, which he does intend to replace at some point in the near future. Inside there are some pieces of carbon trim to try and liven the thing up, some VXR dials which I have to say look desperately cheap, although nothing compared to the indicator and wash wipe stalks. Those are horrendous. Even in 2002 they would have looked really awful and out of date. No wonder Saab didn't use them. The gear lever also looks comically large, though in the hand it actually isn't anywhere near as bad as you might expect. It reminds me a lot of the item that Aston Martin used for a little bit. However, the thing I'm most in love with currently are these seats. They're Recaros and they're wonderful. A combination of leather and fabric, and they really do hug you. There's a reason that even the seat makers that I know hold Recaro in high regard. They really are the best. Perhaps the most surprising piece of standard kit on this car, though, is the adaptive dampers, which even today isn't something you get on all performance cars, and in the late 2000s you certainly didn't get as standard. They have two modes, normal and sport, activated by the big button down here. However, as you can probably tell, they're not brilliantly set up, and they're one of the main reasons the Vectra VXR did not get much love when it was new. The Evo magazine verdict for this car was particularly damning. It said on the plus side, it was a great idea, and on the negative side, it was poorly executed. In fact, just about every review for this car gave it 3 out of 5 stars, 5 or 6 out of 10. And that just isn't good enough, particularly when you're talking about a segment that at the time was very, very hotly contested. The VXR really, I think, tried to make its name by offering value for money. In the most simple of terms, it gave you more power for less cash. In terms of market position, it was of course much closer to the likes of a Ford than a BMW, and it had, with its turbo, a much pokier engine than the old Mondeo ST220, but nowhere near as much as, say, an M3 or a C63 or the like, but it also wasn't anywhere near as expensive as those either. Road testers, though, can sometimes be a little bit harsh and unfair on cars like the VXR, so time to find out what I think of it. I can see why people weren't all that complimentary about it. It's nippy, for sure, not devastatingly quick, but it never was going to be, with 280 or 320 horses and a big four-door saloon body to cart around, which weighs about 1,500 kilos. You could also have had these as an estate, by the way, and in that guise particularly, I think the car probably makes the most sense, because if you can view it as a practical car first and performance car second, you could probably justify it a little bit easier. As performance car first, though, I am struggling to make a case for this car. Torque steer is certainly the order of the day. Put your foot down in any of the first 3 gears and the wheel does wriggle and writhe around in your hand quite a bit. They have evidently tried to mask that a little bit, but all I think they've achieved in the process is just to dull and blunt the steering feel, which is a shame, because the wheel actually has a kind of nice weighting to it, and there are moments where it really talks to you, but when it does, you realize what it's saying is, help me, help me. The front end is very unruly in this car, and it doesn't instill masses and masses of confidence. I know I said earlier that this car is mechanically pretty sound, and I stand by that statement, but evidently there are still a few things that need to be done. Every now and again I get an odd wobble coming through, though I haven't yet managed to work out exactly why or even when it's happening to be able to give George some useful feedback. The odd whoosh from the turbo is quite a laugh, and I'm sure would have very much appealed to this car's target audience. I suppose the easiest way to describe to you the sort of audience that Vauxhall thought they were going to have with this car is by playing you a segment of a genuine film from the old VXR YouTube channel. I can't play much of it because of music rights and the like, but this is what they thought would appeal to VXR customers. Yeah, I know, right? I mean, if I were to film this car appropriately, I shouldn't be doing the drive-by shots like I have. No. My drive-by shots should look like this. I have put the car now in sport mode, and in some ways I think I've made it a little bit better. Evidently it changes something about the traction control program, because it does feel like the car has a lot more bite and a bit of determination in the corners versus standard mode. By default it's actually a really very American combination of too stiff and crashy, but also too wallowy. With sport mode disengaged, you try and go through a bend and it does really feel like the whole car is just going to try and run away from you. I've only just got it up to the national speed limit and it's doing all of that nonsense. It's yeah. unruly, underpowered. It's kind of doing that sort of thing. I do not know what is going on. I don't think, or I hope, that that is not standard. Brakes don't have masses of feel, though they do bring the car to a stop when I tell them, and I'm very glad that it's dry today. So this was strictly a two-wheel drive affair. Saab at the time did dabble with four-wheel drive, and so did the later Insignia VXR. Curiously, according to Vauxhall's own website, this is actually marginally quicker to 60 than the first-gen Insignia. They did a sportier version which then took the crown back, but this does it in 6.1 seconds and the Insignia 6.2. Which is surprising when that car allegedly has more power. They claim 325 horses for that versus 280 for this, and all-wheel drive. Curious. More evidence perhaps for this car not really being 280 horsepower? Perhaps. In defense of this car's interior, though I'm generally not very complimentary about it, and I think it deserves that, when you consider the fact this car is now on 132,000 miles, and they likely haven't been easy ones, it has actually at least worn fairly well. Even the seat bolster is looking pretty good, and all the switchgear is in annoyingly decent condition, actually. If anything, I'd say someone's clocked this car the wrong way. Just about the only thing that isn't behaving is the screen up here, which has got some horrid marks on it. It looks like someone's drawn over it with a pen, but that's not how it is. Like with the previous Vectra, the fuel economy in here is also somewhat impressive. When you consider that myself and George have both had fun in it, the car's average of 24.8 over the last 400 miles is actually pretty good. I must give it some credit. I have now thrown it through a couple of bends and it's actually held on better than I would have expected. You kind of have to drive it like a bit of a hot hatch. The front wheel drive bit evidently contributing to that feeling, I think. And then you think you've really piled on some serious speed. You look down and you go, oh, I'm doing 55, am I? I thought that was 75. I will also say that though it's certainly effective, the engine's just not exciting. Response is pretty good, perhaps better than I recall it being in the other V6 Turbo, but that may just be my memory playing tricks on me. However, it just doesn't seem in any way, shape or form interested in going to its 6,500 RPM red line. From 3,000 onwards, it's just flat and uninteresting. No reward whatsoever for revving it out, barring the noise, which is quite nice, I must admit. You even get the odd crack or pop on a very well executed upshift. That's nice. Visibility is actually okay. The A pillar is quite thick. B pillar is also, but not too far forward to get in your way. The rear view is actually pretty decent, and I have to say, when the car's not being too challenged, it's also pretty comfortable. I'm actually going to drop it out of sport mode for a little bit, and the whole thing has relaxed quite a lot. There are, as you might expect for a Vauxhall of this age, a few rattles in the cabin, though I think the major culprit is the cover for the boot, which, as with the previous car, is very, very generous indeed. Sadly, I don't think it's really much of a surprise that this car failed to do well. Certainly by the time the likes of the BMW 335i landed, I can think of almost no reasons why you would have one of these over one of those. Certainly compared to an M3, which, yes, I know, would have been a lot more money, but it's the top performance car in its segment of the respective manufacturers, so the comparison isn't entirely daft. Then you have the likes of things like that FN2 Civic Type R over there, which would have also given you big thrills, big smiles, and at a lower price, and with a better interior too. So this really was sort of caught between two worlds. The whole approach of trying to just throw more power at something and not finesse it at all wasn't ever going to last all that long. And though I think with the Insignia, Vauxhall did try to make a slightly more rounded, refined and grown-up car, the simple fact is that wasn't what appealed to the people that bought these. So they tried to make things better, but it just never ever was going to work. You do have to feel for them a little bit, don't you? And I don't think it's really a surprise to anybody that the kind of people who bought these cars, particularly in later years, weren't the sort of people to lavish care and attention on them. Over time, I'm sure more than a few found their way into local hedgerows. Many more, I'm sure, were modified, blown up, sent to the scrapyard, or simply forgotten about and left to rot on a driveway. This means that today there are very, very few of these remaining. How few? Well, on Auto Trader at the moment, there are none. The only Vectra VXRs I could find were on eBay, and I'm sure there's a few on Facebook Marketplace and Gumtree too, and prices are wild. They range from a few £1,000s up to about 15 grand. But I think if I were to call this a £5,000 car, then I could just about make a case for it. It isn't a very finessed thing. The handling is iffy at best, and I don't think you're ever going to fix it. It does make a semi-pleasing noise though, and it's certainly quick enough for many, but most performance hatchbacks, even of the day, I think would have been better behaved and really just as practical, I'm sure, in the ways that mattered. However, today you sort of look back on things like this with a little bit of fondness and go, yeah, I remember those. They were weird. Or you go, yeah, I remember those. Mate of mine had 3. Wrote them all off on the same bend. And though were I to try and tell you that there's any sort of sensible or logical reason to buy a car like this, I'd be a liar. I am equally as glad that there are people out there like George who are willing to take a punt on things like this, put the money in required to save them, restore them to their former glory, and then enjoy them as they should have been, hoofing through an industrial estate at 70 miles an hour at 3 AM in the morning. No, George, I think, is a little bit more sensible than that. Or is he? He did buy a Vectra VXR, so I have to remember that. Anyway, I'm really glad he's brought the car out today and given me the chance to experience it. And as ever, I'm thankful to all of you for watching as well. So don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.